All right, good evening. It's good to see everybody tonight. Glad you're here. Glad we can spend this time together. This is technically the first night of the new quarter, but when we started switching out teaching between the high school and out here, we decided that it would be good to have the review night out here with the people who just taught the class. And so that's what we're going to do tonight, is review. And then Sunday, of course, is our gospel meeting, Wednesday night as well. And so next Lord's Day, not this coming one, but the next one, you'll start looking at the life of Christ with Brother Lonnie and Collier teaching that. Brother Lonnie and Brother Collier, I should say, teaching that. So tonight we're going to review, and this quarter we covered 3 Bible periods. So if you're visiting with us, we do a study of the Bible, and we divide the Bible up into 17 Bible periods. And the 3 that we looked at this time were the captivity, the return and rebuilding, and the years of silence. And so that takes, if you look at the captivity, it takes about, well, how long does the captivity take? How many years are we talking about? About 70 years, that's right. And then we've got the return and rebuilding, which gets us from the first return is in 536, and the last one will be in the 440s. So that'll get us a couple of 100 and so years down the road. And then really the last book of the Old Testament, which we'll look at in just a bit, reviewing wise, is in the 430s probably written. So we looked at the time period from about 600 BC till about 430 BC. So covered about, 170 years overall. So there's a lot contained in there. And we won't be able to say anything about all of it tonight, but we will be able to say something about some of it. And so we want to do that tonight. Just setting up the story. When we look at the timeline, we started in about 606. And what happens in 606? First invasion, Babylon invades into Judea. Judah takes the first captives. And who did we look at that was part of that first group? Daniel. That's exactly right. So Daniel, probably his prophecy is from about 606, 605, all the way down to 536 when the first returnees will go home. But just setting up that story, that's when the first captives are taken. So people like Daniel, we've talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We'll talk about them some more in just a few minutes. But they were among that first group of captives to go in. Now in 597, they lay siege to Jerusalem. This is the Babylonian army laying siege to Jerusalem. They will take Jerusalem. And in 586, 587, 586, they will even destroy the temple. And those are the key moments that kind of begin this period of captivity. Now, we'll go back and talk about some of that in just a little bit because Daniel and Ezekiel cover some of that. But that kind of sets us up for this Bible period. So we were in the period of what was called Judah alone, because Israel had been taken into captivity in 722 BC. So we go a long way down the road, and we are in Judah alone. And then we come to the early 600s, late 600s, I guess you would say. And that's when Judah starts to fall apart. So that kind of sets us up, and we're going to look at a little bit of Daniel 1 in just a second, if you haven't already turned there. You have anything to say as far as introduction, leading us into all that?
I'm only here if you go silent.
Okay. I got you. All right. Well, you said that we needed to mic up, and I thought really we need to mic them up so I can ask questions and everybody can hear the answers. Because we've done the teaching. We got to see how good we did if they know the answer. All right. So looking at the first couple of verses of Daniel is what I'm thinking about here. And I want to ask you, how does the beginning of Daniel 1 help us to understand this captivity period? What do you learn from the first couple of verses of Daniel 1 about the captivity? That's exactly right. So the captivity, I think it's really important for us to reflect on that, because it might be possible, and I think this was exactly the case, that the rulers of these foreign nations thought that the captivity was a failure of Judah's God. And I think that it's really important for us to keep a handle on, as we think about this captivity, that this is not a failure of Israel, of Judah's God. This is a keeping of his promise. This is a keeping, maybe we should even say, of his warning, if we think of promise as having good tones. Because in verse 2 it says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he, I take that to be, this is Nebuchadnezzar, brought them into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Notice what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. He's taking these pieces as if they are trophies. He's taking them from the house of the Lord, from the house of Yahweh, and putting them into the house of his Babylonian God. He thinks this is a win of his God over Judah's God. But just the very passage itself, the Lord gave, the way it begins, shows us that this is not a victory of Babylon's gods over Judah's gods. This is God keeping his warnings that he had made to them all along. Now, when we look at Daniel chapter 1, at the very end of that, so just as an introduction to the book of Daniel, we're not going to look at this right now, but in verse 21, Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. I think that takes us all the way down to at least 539 and maybe even 536, because I think Daniel gets to see some of the first captives go home as well. And so that's going to be, he's going to have about a 70-year career in Babylon as one of those first ones that go. But I think Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 gives us a very good theological understanding, a very good foundation for understanding the captivity before we go any further. Yes, Nebuchadnezzar besieged it. Yes, Nebuchadnezzar took down the walls. Yes, he destroyed the temple. But he did it all because the Lord was giving it to him. And I think that's important to hold on to. When we talked about the books of Kings and Chronicles, I think the book of Kings is answering the question, how did we end up here? And I think the book of Kings is saying because of our sin and because of God's warnings. Now, the book of Chronicles, I could imagine somebody like Ezra writing the book of Chronicles, because the book of Chronicles is, okay, what do we do now that we get to go home? And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, any thoughts or questions or comments about just our introduction to this? So when we look at Daniel and his friends, what kind of people are Daniel and we'll say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? What kind of people are they? The best of the best. As far as we know, they're a high caliber people, especially compared to the fact that the people were so sinful they had to be taken into captivity. So the fact there is a Daniel, there is a Shadrach, there is a Meshach and an Abednego in existence is a pretty notable thing because you've got good men there. Now, when we talk about what kind of men were they, what role do they go into when they go into Babylon? They're going to be part of the king's court. That's exactly right. So they're going to be treated as kind of like bureaucrats, officials, scribes, wise men. They're not going to be way up on the ranking list in that, but they're going to learn all of the wisdom that Babylon has to offer, and they're going to be able to be kind of they're going to be at least connected to the upper levels of things. They're going to be connected to Nebuchadnezzar when it's under the Babylonian. He's the emperor of the largest empire in the world at that time, and they're going to be right there with connection to him. So they're going to be in kind of a high status situation. Daniel, it seems, is going to be able to get promoted more than any of the other ones. But that's kind of the situation, the status that they are in. So that takes us kind of through chapter 1. We won't look at all the details of that. But one thing that I like to think about Daniel is that he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Whatever the challenge would have been, I think we could see in Daniel a man who had purposed his heart that he was going to serve the Lord. And I think that's a great practical lesson. We won't spend a lot of time on that, but purposing in our heart, in preparation, in advance of challenges we're going to face, purposing in our heart the right thing to do is a very Daniel-like thing, and I think commendable.
And you've already touched on this, I think, but we can already begin to see God working behind the scenes here. You know, I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar, as he was making these decisions, was making them with selfish intentions. He thought he was being crafty by promoting these young men into his positions,
Yeah.
but the way it's going to turn out is he's actually working for God and don't even realize it.
That's right. And we're going to get some revelation as a result of all that. It reminds me of the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk says, are you going to do, this is before, this is, you can see on the chart there, this is before they go into captivity. Habakkuk looks around and says, what are you going to do about wicked Judah? And God says, I'll tell you, I'm bringing the Chaldeans. I'm bringing the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says, what do you mean you're bringing the Babylonians? They're worse than we are. The Lord says, I'm going to use them. And the just shall live by faith, Habakkuk 2, verse 4 says. And Habakkuk has to learn to trust God in the use of all of that. Well, that's a very good point. So speaking of Daniel's interaction with Nebuchadnezzar and God using them, describe to me the image that Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 2. You can do it piece by piece. You can do it all at once, whatever you'd like.
It's just this huge statue.
He sees this huge statue, this huge image, I think is one of the words that's used.
And there's different parts.
There's different parts. And what are the different parts made up of? Precious metals, precious stone, however we want to describe that. The top of that is made out of gold. And who did that represent? Babylon, right? Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. So Daniel is able to tell Nebuchadnezzar, this is you, this is your kingdom. And the second part of it was made out of silver. Daniel explains that to Nebuchadnezzar as what? The Medo-Persian. He doesn't use that term, but he says there's a kingdom coming after you that's going to replace you, and we know it to be the Medo-Persian that's going to be led by Cyrus. All right, the next one is it brazen? Bronze is the next part, and it represents, we know it to represent Greece. And we see more of this later on in Daniel, but we won't have time to make all the comparisons. I think Daniel 2 is really helpful for us. And then you've got the iron, and then the iron mixed with clay, and that represents the Roman Empire, right? So Daniel sees this vision of the 4 great kingdoms that are going to control that part of the world along the way. There are other things going on in the world, right? There's things happening in China. There's things happening in the Americas. That's not what Daniel's concerned about. Daniel's concerned about the 4 empires that are going to come to power, especially in the world where God's people are living at the time. And so those 4 dynasties, not the right word. Those 4 empires are being described. Now, Daniel 2, verse 44 is the key verse. Would somebody read Daniel 2, verse 44? Mr. Colby, you want to read 2, verse 44?
And then in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever.
Very good. All right, so why is that passage significant? Why does it matter? Yeah, it talks about God's kingdom come. What'd you say, Miss Amanda? The church. Yeah, God's people, right? God in the midst, I think he's pointing to that 4th kingdom, right? In the midst of those days, in the days of those kings, God's going to set up a kingdom. Right? God has always been king, but he's going to set up a kingdom in a new way. Namely, he's going to send the king, right? He's going to send the king. And the kingdom is going to be set up around him, around the Messiah that's coming. And we talked about that a little bit a couple of Sundays ago. But all that is to say is God promises through Daniel in this conversation with Nebuchadnezzar, yes, there are great kingdoms coming, but nothing like the one God's going to set up. It's a stone uncut by man that's going to destroy all these other ones, and it's going to last not just for a few generations, but it's going to last forever. And that's the nature of the kingdom in Daniel 2, verse 44. All right. Now, we also have an interesting passage in Daniel chapter 3. This is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And just give me a lesson that we learned from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Trust God, right? They say our God will deliver us. But if he doesn't, that's all right. We're still not going to bow down.
Stand when nobody else will stand.
That's right. Now, you got 3 young men in the midst of a whole crowd of people bowing down, and it seems to be elite official people, and they won't bow down even when the threats are turned up. Were you going to say something? He said, okay, gotcha.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. We're all thinking alike. That's good. Okay. So when we studied this, normally we would jump right to Ezekiel right now because Ezekiel would fill in this spot. I'm going to wait and we'll just finish the book of Daniel and then we'll come back and look at Ezekiel. But we kind of plugged Ezekiel in right here because we kind of get Daniel and his friends situated and then we go over and look at Ezekiel. But let's just look at the whole book of Daniel. In Daniel 4, the great lesson of Daniel 4. Anybody remember that? Could you summarize it in just a phrase or two? Pride comes before the fall. That would be a good way to describe it, right? Nebuchadnezzar experiences that. That's a good one phrase. There's a phrase, I think it's repeated 2 or 3 times in this. God's going to be glorified. What does Nebuchadnezzar need to come to know? That God rules in the kingdoms of men. I think that may very well be a theme of the whole book of Daniel. But it seems to kind of come to a point in chapter 4. Isn't this the chapter where Nebuchadnezzar is humiliated, and as a result of his humiliation, he's humbled, and as a result of his humbling, he does come to understand that it is God, it's Yahweh who rules in the kingdoms of men.
Verse 17 says, "This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, give it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men."
Very good. Yeah, so Nebuchadnezzar, if he had any pretensions, just keep in mind that God could set over it the lowest of men. Right? It doesn't mean anything necessarily about Nebuchadnezzar's status to have been one that's exalted over the Babylonian Empire. Now he'll forget that, be boasting to himself about what he built, and then he'll be humbled. And then we come to chapter 5. And there's a key event that happens in chapter 5. What is that key event? The writing on the wall. That's right. And the writing on the wall, tiki, something.
Here it is.
Mini, tickle, ufarson. That's it. Not tiki. I don't know what I'm thinking. Mini, tickle ufarson. I got to be careful with these foreign languages. Who knows what I'll end up saying?
But it means God has numbered your kingdom and finished it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So they've been weighed in the balance, right? And they were found wanting. And so a key event happens that night. And what is that? Yes, that's exactly right. So Darius comes in. I think he's probably some kind of military official, but whatever. Cyrus, the Persian king, is going to take over. It's going to be the end of the Babylonian regime over the empire, and the Persians are going to take over. The Medo-Persians are going to take over. Now, we will continue with Daniel and his story, but he is now under, we're talking about 539 now. We're talking about 536 when he is talking now. And all of that is going to be under Persian power, not under Babylonian power. And it doesn't make much difference to us who's in power. It would change things for the people of Israel quite considerably because the Babylonians ruled with a pretty heavy hand, and the Persians are going to take a much different approach to things as we move forward. So that's 4 and 5. Daniel 6, we won't have to take a long time to review that because it's probably the most famous of the stories in Daniel. It's the story of Daniel and the lion's den. A lot of good lessons. But really, I think the main lesson is still that the pagan nations needed to learn something about God. And I think Darius does learn something about God in all of that. I don't have anything specific about chapter 6. Is there anything that you want to highlight about it? I think we know that story very well, and I don't want to lose sight of that and downplay it because of that. But
no, I don't have anything.
Yeah. So we come to this section in Daniel. Daniel 7 through 12 is what we would call apocalyptic. And generally, when we use the word apocalyptic, everybody thinks we're talking about end times, right? Oh, the apocalypse is upon us. They think we're talking about the end times. And the reason people think that is they read the book of Revelation, which is called the apocalypse, and they think, end of times. But the word apocalypse really means revelation, the unveiling, the pulling back of the curtain. So this section of Daniel is apocalyptic literature. It's literature that allows us to kind of pull back the curtain, to unveil and see what's really happening. And I think what we get in Daniel 7 through 12 is an unveiling that God is at work in the rise and fall of the kingdoms of men. It is not as if God is not working. We may not be able to see it on an earth level, right? We may see the rise and fall of nations and kingdoms and not see what's going on. Daniel 7 through 12 is a section that says God is at work and has plans and purposes for all this. We'll talk about this maybe more if we have time at the end, but there is a plan for a son of man that's coming, who's going to stand in the presence of God, verses 13 and 14 of chapter 7. Chapters 8 and 9, I think, talk about Daniel's prayer because he knows that it's time for the return to happen. So he has this long prayer in Daniel 9, praying that God would show compassion. And God says, I am. And even in 9 and 10 shows here's what's going to happen to the people of God in the next few hundred years. And ultimately points forward to the destruction in some ways of the nation of Israel, but pointing forward to a resurrection in chapter 12 of the good and the evil, a resurrection, which was a key passage for a lot of Jews during Jesus' day, looking forward to a resurrection. That was a key passage they would have looked to. So I don't have a lot more to say about Daniel, except these visions, I think, teach us that in the operations of the kingdoms of men and even in the operations of the nation of Judah, God was still going to be at work, even if they weren't always able to see his hand directly involved. Any thoughts on the book of Daniel? Anything else to say about that?
One more thing I might say about it is we mentioned a couple of times the integrity of Daniel that he's shown. And, as far as making application for us, I would say that we never know when we are put in a Daniel type situation. And our character and our integrity is going to play a big role in that, whether we bring somebody to Christ or whether, people are watching the way that we live our lives as Christians. And just like Daniel was an influence, I think we need to keep in mind that we're an influence on the world as well.
That's right. That's something we see a lot in this Bible period, is people who are in various and sundry positions and the way God uses them. And Daniel, and then, of course, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are great examples of using that moment well. And because we see people who are turned to the Lord in all of that. So that would be a good lesson from the lion's den. It's a good lesson from chapter 1, not eating the defiled food. It's a good lesson from chapter 3, not bowing down to the idol. All of that. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments on the book of Daniel? Daniel is probably the best known of the captivity prophets. The other one is Ezekiel, and you can see Ezekiel on the timeline right here. Now, how is Ezekiel different than Daniel, like at least in his position?
He would be a priest.
He was a priest. That's exactly right. He is not, this is where I was going, he's not in that kind of like inner court of the king. He seems to be dealing more with the ordinary people. Now, let's see. Do you have any key ideas from Ezekiel? Oh, it's 48 chapters. So basically anything that the Bible teaches, there's a chance we'll find it in Ezekiel. All right. It's a long book. But were there any particular themes that stuck to you out of Ezekiel that you remember?
Ezekiel kind of gives the people of the land their play-by-play of what was going on in Judah.
That's exactly right. Yes. And what does he say about that? Like, what do they think is going to happen, and what does he say is going to happen?
They think they're going to return.
They think it's going to be smooth sailing, right? They think, yeah, this is a bad moment. God's not going to let us suffer here. We'll go right back. Nothing's really going to happen to the city. And Ezekiel says, judgment is near, right? Judgment has happened, and more judgment is coming. It's about to get way worse before it gets any better. All right? Now, Ezekiel does point forward to better. But the better is basically from like chapter 36 on, right? Like the better is way down the road. he spends a lot of time talking about judgment. That doesn't mean there aren't glimmers of hope in Ezekiel. There are through the book. There are glimmers of hope. But he spends a lot of time saying it's going to get worse before it gets better. He had a particular way of talking about how it was going to get worse. Do you remember what is kind of the way that Ezekiel describes it getting worse, at least at the beginning, and then a way that it's better? Symbolically, yes. I mean, he has some symbols, doesn't he? He has some pretty powerful ways of describing that. Something that Ezekiel sees. I'm trying to ask the question without giving it away. What does Ezekiel see that's such a powerful testament to how bad things are going to get? Okay, so he sees the besieging of the city. He kind of doesn't he lay down around it pretending. What'd you say? He did build a little model and showed it. He cut off some of his beard, and I don't remember all the details of that, but scatters it around. So here's what I was thinking. In one of those visions, he goes back and he sees the glory of the Lord departing the temple. The presence of the Lord is a key theme for Ezekiel. Ezekiel, I think, as Mr. Colby mentioned, being a priest, I think connects him to that temple imagery so well that he's a good person to be talking about what all this is going to mean. And so he sees the glory of the Lord depart the temple, moving to the east. I think standing over, rising over the Mount of Olives, but not in the temple anymore. The last verse of the book of Ezekiel, God says he's going to build a new city. And what's the name of that city? The Lord is there. That's a good theme, I think, to tie together the book of Ezekiel. Early on, Ezekiel is able to see the glory of the Lord where he is in Babylon, by the river Kibar, right? He's able to see it. He is allowed to see, maybe he's unfortunate to see the glory of the Lord departing the temple. Then at the very end, he pictures chapters 40 through 48, a new temple being built. And the very last verse of the book, the name of that city will be the Lord is there. God's presence, Yahweh is there. There's one other thing, and I'll just go ahead and mention this. I think the power of the Lord is a key thing. There's 70 times at least in the book that you may know that I am the Lord is repeated. And there's other things we could look at. I love the picture in Ezekiel 36 of taking out the people's heart of stone and giving them a heart of flesh. I love the image in chapter 37 of making the dead bones arise as the Spirit speaks to them. I think it's chapter 34. There's the discussion of God saying his people are like sheep without a shepherd. And he says, but one day I'm coming and I'm going to be their shepherd and I'm going to take care of them. And then he says, I'm going to have a king and he will be their shepherd. And you're like, wait a second, how's God going to be the shepherd and the king going to be the shepherd? And I think I know the answer. And it's called Emmanuel, God with us. I think that's chapter 34. I love the parts in Ezekiel that talk about the role of a messenger, right? What Ezekiel's role is going to be. He has to preach it. And if he preaches it and they don't listen, then he doesn't have any blood on his hands. But if he has the message and he doesn't preach it and they needed to know it, then he's in trouble. And so you have a lot of, if the righteous man departs from his righteous way and becomes a sinner, he's going to be judged. If the sinner departs from his righteous way and turns to righteousness, God will accept him. I honestly, so I'm not a Calvinist, right? And maybe one of the major reasons from that is because I heard so many lessons about Ezekiel 18 when I was younger. And Ezekiel 18, I think, just ruins the idea of Calvinism. The idea that we're born in sin? No. The soul that sins shall die, is what the text says. I'm not condemned because of Adam's sin. I'm condemned because of my sin. The idea that it's once saved, always saved? No. The righteous man can turn away. The idea that once you're saved, the idea that it's unconditional election, that you don't have any choice in this, not true. You can turn. That's why Ezekiel is sent to make the call. So I just think it's a very practical passage for when we think about how salvation works. It's not all God, right? He's made the offer, and we can turn to that or we can turn away from it. Okay, everybody good? I know you've had a long day. We're just now in Ezekiel. We haven't even made it halfway through our time period. So I know you got up early. Lots of you dealt with kids all day, and now you have to listen to me. It's terrible. All right. Any thoughts or comments, questions, passages about Ezekiel? There's a lot more we could look at, of course. But I will say this. I think the idea of the presence of the Lord is a really good binding way of thinking about the book of Ezekiel. The middle section is a lot about judgment on the nations. But if we think about what's said about Judah at the beginning and what God's plan is at the end, God's presence being there is a really big part of that. Okay, so we can come back now. Let's go to Ezra 1 through 4. We don't have to take a long time there. We got about 15 minutes to get through. So that was the captivity period. The captivity will kind of continue, but in 536, a big thing happens, and we've got that first return. And what was the goal? Okay, so who led that first return? Zerubbabel. There was another key fellow. Jeshua, that's right. So you've got the Zerubbabel, isn't he a line of David guy, right? And then you've got Jeshua, who is a high priest, pretty important roles to be filled. And so they lead this return back. And what's the goal of the people in Ezra 1 through 4? They want to rebuild the temple, right? This is the key thing. This is the symbol of God's presence for sure. And so we want to consider that. Okay, so they come back 536 to rebuild the temple. They get started. They lay a foundation. Then what derails the project, at least for the moment? Yes, the Samaritans, there are enemy people. So the Samaritans are the people who live up in Samaria, north of where Judah is. And they derail the project, make threats to them, say they're going to turn them in and all this kind of stuff. So that basically takes us chapters 1 through 4 in the book of Ezra, is this great return home, is all of this excitement, and then we get right to the beginning of chapter 5 and things have stopped. All right? Now, I think we should pause here in the book of Ezra because a lot of time is going to pass in the intervening years between 4 and 5. And in chapter 5, verse 1, we're introduced to two men. What were their names? Haggai and Zechariah. Now, what's their role? They're prophets. What is Haggai's message? Get back to work. And he says it pretty directly, right? He's not beating around the bush, right? Even a burning bush that God speaks of. He's getting right to the point. He is saying, you have spent time getting your houses repaired. Now you're wondering why it seems like there's holes in your pockets and you can't reap and eat. It's just running out. He says the problem is was there not time for you to spend time on the house? And he even points forward to Shealtiel, who I think is going to be a preview of Jesus and will even be in the messianic line down the road. Okay, so that's Haggai's message. It's pretty clear and direct. The other guy is Zechariah. And what is Zechariah's message? He does. Zechariah does try to encourage us. How is he different from Haggai? He has visions, right? Haggai has something to say. Zechariah has something to say. But Zechariah says it in a lot more challenging way. I think I have a list of his visions here. I'm not sure if I can run through very quickly and find it. No, it's going to take a minute. That's a lot. So look at all this stuff we're overlooking. Oh, yeah, so here's his visions. This carries us through 6 chapters. And basically, I think Zechariah's point in these visions is that while the temple that you're building is not great, God's still at work. And there's going to be ultimately a spiritual Jerusalem that's rebuilt that God's going to dwell in. So really 1 through 6 are these visions. Now, in chapter 7 through 12, he's still very apocalyptic. But in 7 through 12, I think basically he's giving a picture of hope. Let me give you a few examples. Chapter 9, he talks about the king riding in on a colt, the foal of a donkey, and bringing in the blood of the covenant. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? In chapter 12, there's talk about a fountain being opened, a fountain that will wash away uncleanness and forgive sins. I think that may be the end of 12 and beginning of 13. Chapter 14, there's talk about the Lord reigning over his people. And even a picture of a mountain being divided to provide a place of escape for his people to run. It's almost like the Red Sea, but instead of water being divided, it's a mountain being divided so his people have a place to flee. Powerful pictures of rescue, forgiveness, salvation being portrayed in Zechariah. So what I think Zechariah is, I know he is because of Ezra 5 verse 1. He's right there at the same time Haggai is. And while Haggai is saying, hey guys, let's get to work, Zechariah is saying, you have no idea what God has in store. And even as we read Zechariah, I think the pictures maybe astound us that he's seeing so clearly what God was going to do in Christ, and he's expressing that with vision. And so while Haggai is more focused on getting people to work right now, I think Zechariah is pointing way down the line and saying, the things you're doing now are just a preview of what God's ultimately going to do with and for and in his people, and especially in Christ.
Well, that message was to motivate them because they didn't see clearly
Yeah.
what kind of difference they were really making.
I think that's right. I think their heartbreak at what the temple looked like.
Right.
I think probably, and I think it's one passage in Zechariah. I want to say it might be in chapter 2 that he says, "Don't despise the day of small things." That appears at least a couple of times, but I think Zechariah says that in chapter 2. I may be wrong about that. But basically, I think the idea is don't think small of doing God's will, even when it looks small to you. Man, that's a good application, isn't it? There are things that we do that, if we were to look at them, we would despise the day of small things. We'd say, well, what good is that going to do? And ultimately, we don't know what good it's going to do. If we are doing faithfully what God's called us to do, he can and will use it for his purposes. All right, so that carries us from Ezra 1 to chapter 5 and verse 1, and we've looked at both of the prophets in that period. Any comments on Haggai or Zechariah, anything through that?
Well, the motivation that Gerald talks about there, we see that it works.
Yes.
Beginning in chapter 5, because, and I don't mean to,
No, sir.
but to kind of move on here, after Haggai and Zechariah, we see the motivation work, because what was finished? What happened? They got back to work and they finished the temple, right? And even in a few verses later, when it comes time in verse 19 of chapter 6, we see the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. So they, after Haggai and Zechariah's encouragement, they finished the temple regardless of any opposition that they faced, and it seems that they got their mind back on spiritual things.
That's exactly right. That's right. So 1 through 4, they come back, start building the temple, don't get it done. Chapter 5 and 6, they get it done. Haggai and Zechariah encourage them. That takes us down to the year 516. The temple is rebuilt, and that is helped by the encouragement of Haggai and Zechariah. Now, in the class, we took a pause there as well. We went and saw Esther. Let me just ask a couple of questions about Esther. What's unique about the book of Esther? It doesn't mention God, and yet, how do we know that God is active? Yes, because his people are saved. And I love the phrase of Mordecai. This is at the end of chapter 4, isn't it? He says, who knows? Maybe you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Maybe this is God's providence in operation. So that takes us through Esther. I think there are a lot of things that we can look at in the book of Esther that we would say Mordecai and Esther have really good plans, but ultimately God's working in the nuances of life is what is able to bring them, the Jewish people, their salvation. Of course, we can't rehearse that story. But we come back to the book of Ezra. And who's the key character? Of course, the Lord is the key character in all of this, right? We see the Lord at work in all of this. But who's the key character of Ezra 7 through 10?
Ezra himself.
Ezra. He even named the book after himself. Ezra. Ezra. Yeah. So what's Ezra's role? What's his office? He's a scribe, and he's of the priestly family, it looks like. He comes back, and his goal is not to rebuild the temple. It's been rebuilt. His job is to reestablish the law. I sometimes say rebuild the people, get them back. And there's a couple of major issues that are there. There's the marriage issues is maybe the main one. But there's feast day issues, and so he will read the law to them, and we'll see more of that in Nehemiah. But in the book of the book of Ezra, Ezra becomes kind of the main character in that, leading that kind of restoration movement, maybe we could call it that, for a little while. Then we come to the end of the book of Ezra that takes us through chapter 10. And then we come to the book of Nehemiah. And what's Nehemiah's goal? To rebuild the walls. And what are some things that characterize Nehemiah? If you were describing Nehemiah, what would you say? Right? He's a man of prayer. That was first on my list. He's focused. He has a job to do and won't go to the valley of Ono to meet with enemies to get distracted from it. What else? He's a patriot, right? He is brokenhearted at the status, the condition of his people. What else would you say? Those are all good things. If you want to say more about the things you've said, that's fine too. He is. And he is encouraged by the people, right? They have a good relationship. The people had a mind to work. He's right there with them. He even gives up some of his salary for their sake, but he's right there working with them. I think Nehemiah probably is the last major character that we see in the Old Testament. I think he goes back to Babylon and comes back while Malachi probably is prophesying. And so while Malachi is the last prophet, I think Nehemiah might be the last person that we see chronologically in that story. All right, then we come to Malachi, and we only have a couple of minutes, but what are some key themes of Malachi?
You failed.
You failed, right? Here we are again, right? We're in 432. Yeah.
As far as their service to the Lord.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and we made this point. There is still kind of an idolatry. It's a selfish kind of idolatry. But they're not building an altar to some other god. They're not making a statue, but they are not pleasing to God. He says in chapter 1, I wish somebody would close the doors to the worship service, because they're bringing in lame stuff. And they don't see how God has been affectionate toward them. They don't see how God has chosen them. And so basically, Malachi says, you failed. So then what does he say? That's really, I think, chapters 1 and 2 is a lot of you failed. He talks about what's coming. I think chapter 3, he says, I'm going to send my messenger, or I'm going to send, my messenger who will prepare the way before me. And he talks a lot about judgment and things. People are going to be divided. There's going to be a purifying process coming. The last couple of things in the book of Malachi are that you need to remember the law. Keep in mind the law of Moses. Obey that, because Elijah is coming, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and turn the hearts of the children to the fathers. What does that mean? Here's what I think it means. There's a passage in Isaiah, and I have to look it up to tell you. I've got it in my Luke notes. But I think what he's saying is they are living in a way where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the fathers, would look at the children and just they'd have to turn their face away. They wouldn't want to look at it. And the children look back at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they don't need to look at them because that's too much of, they don't measure up to that. But imagine a day where the people of God are faithful, and the hearts of the fathers could be turned towards the children, and the hearts of the children could be turned towards them. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob could look down at their descendants and say, yeah, those are my people. And the descendants could look back at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and say, those are my fathers. And that's what we have in Christ, because Abraham's the father of many nations in Christ. Okay, last period we talked about the years of silence. Years of silence, right? And any key developments that you want to think about? One thing that I would say, spread of the Greek language is going to be the key one, maybe for the New Testament. Our New Testaments are written in Greek because of what happens through Alexander the Great in the 300s. right? He spreads the Greek language all over the place, and it doesn't go away for a long, long time. And then I would say that we need to understand that the Roman Empire is going to be in control of Judah, of Israel and Judah. So when Jesus comes on the scene, lots of Roman names written in Greek language in a society that is controlled by Romans with tax collectors running around. That years of silence helps us get the stakes set. Synagogues where Jews are meeting, road systems, all roads lead to Rome. At the end of the book of Acts, where do we end up? In the city of Rome. And so that Roman rule is going to be certainly important. And I know a lot of that will be highlighted as you go through the life of Christ. But now you can kind of jump into that with your feet in the right place. All right. We are at 7:45. Mr. Allen gave me the wave back there. And so we are good to go. Thank you very much for this quarter. Really enjoyed the time with you.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.